The crystal tray felt cold against Celine Vi's hands as she walked through the upper palace corridor. Midnight meetings were common in LYCANLORE Thorn's court. So were secrets. But tonight, something felt wrong long before she reached the private lounge doors. Voices carried through the partially open entrance ahead. Male laughter, relaxed, careless. Celine slowed automatically when she heard her own name. Inside the room, one of the councilmen spoke first. You announced another alliance beside her tonight. Doesn't Celine suspect something? Cor laughed quietly. Not cruel, not angry, almost amused. She suspects, he said casually. She just stays. More laughter followed. Celine's fingers tightened slightly around the silver tray. Another voice joined in. That loyal. Ka leaned back in his chair inside the lounge. She could picture it without looking. Relaxed posture. Drink in hand. Perfectly comfortable. Then he said the sentence that shattered something permanently inside her. She'll forgive me. She always does. The men laughed harder this time. And then the final blow. She has nowhere else to go. The crystal glass slipped from Celine's hand before she realized her fingers had loosened. It shattered sharply against the marble floor outside the doors. Silence exploded inside the lounge. A chair scraped back instantly. Celine stepped backward before anyone opened the door. Heart steady, face calm, because strangely the pain wasn't sharp anymore, only clear. The lounge doors opened suddenly behind her. Selena, Kair's voice. She turned slowly. He stood in the doorway, wearing mild surprise rather than guilt. Mistake. His eyes dropped briefly toward the shattered glass at her feet, then back to her expression. Something uncertain flickered across his face. How long were you standing there? He asked carefully. Sin looked at him for several quiet seconds. Long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. Long enough, she answered. One of the councilmen appeared behind Car and immediately froze after seeing her. No one spoke, because everyone understood what she heard. Car stepped forward once. Celine. She handed him the documents she'd originally brought calmly, politely. Exactly like every other night, she cleaned up after his mistakes. I think these were important, she said softly. Kair's jaw tightened slightly. You're upset. That almost made her laugh. Not because the statement was wrong, because it was too small, too inadequate for what just ended between them. Celine glanced once toward the men inside the lounge, then back at Cure. No, she said quietly. I'm finished. Something in her tone changed his expression immediately. But before he could speak again, Celine turned around and walked away. No tears, no scene, no screaming accusations through palace corridors, just silence following behind her while the Alpha finally realized this time felt different and for the first time in years. That frightened him. Celine closed her chamber doors softly behind her. The palace remained awake somewhere beyond the walls. Guards changing shifts. Servants moving through corridors. Councilmen drinking beside warm fires. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. Tonight they felt distant, like they already belonged to another life. She crossed the room slowly and opened the wardrobe beside the window, then began packing. One dress, 2 traveling cloaks, a pair of gloves, only necessities. Nothing sentimental. That part surprised her most. 3 years beside Car and almost nothing here felt worth taking. A quiet knock interrupted the silence. Lady Celine Mira, her youngest, maid stepped carefully inside carrying folded linens before freezing at the sight of the open travel bag. My lady, are you traveling? Yes. Mira frowned slightly. At this hour. Celine folded another dress carefully before answering. That's usually the best time to leave places that don't value you. The maid went completely still because that didn't sound temporary. Celine noticed the fear crossing the girl's face and softened her tone slightly. You don't need to worry, but the Alpha will survive. The answer came too quickly, too honestly. Mira lowered her voice carefully. Did something happen? Celine paused beside the wardrobe, then looked down at the silver ribbon, still tied loosely around her wrist. The bond ribbon. Kaya placed it there himself 3 winters ago during the mating ceremony. A promise. Or at least she once believed it was. Now all she could hear was his voice repeating calmly behind closed doors. She'll forgive me. She always does. Celine untied the ribbon slowly. Mira watched nervously. My lady. Celine walked toward the desk near the fireplace, picked up the ceremonial dagger resting beside Car's untouched letters, and sliced the ribbon cleanly in half. The sound felt louder than the blade itself. Mira inhaled sharply because severing a bond ribbon without witnesses carried one meaning only: finality. Celine placed both cut pieces carefully on the desk. No note beside them. No dramatic farewell. Just truth left behind where he couldn't avoid seeing it. She closed her travel bag afterward and fastened the straps tightly. When did you decide this? Mira whispered. Celine thought for a moment, then answered honestly. Probably long before tonight. The maid's eyes watered slightly. Will you come back? Celine looked around the chambers one final time. Cold fireplace, half-empty shelves, rooms she maintained more than she lived in. Then she shook her head once. No. Silence settled heavily between them. Outside, thunder rolled across the distant mountains. Storm coming. Good. Storms made departures easier to hide. Celine pulled her cloak over her shoulders and moved toward the door. But before leaving, she paused beside the table one final time. Her gaze lingered briefly on the severed ribbon. Then she walked away without touching it again. And somewhere deep down, she already knew she would never return to this room. Kylo entered Selena's chambers expecting silence. That part was normal. She often slept early when court politics exhausted her. What he didn't expect was emptiness. The fire had burned out completely. Cold air drifted through partially open balcony curtains. Several wardrobe doors stood open. And Celine was gone. Kaya stopped walking immediately. A strange unease tightened across his chest. Celine, he called once. No answer. A servant near the doorway lowered her eyes nervously. Kai looked toward her sharply. Where is she? The servant hesitated, then quietly. She left, Your Majesty. Silence settled hard through the room. Kyer stepped farther inside slowly, noticing details one after another. Missing dresses, missing travel cloak, jewelry untouched. Only practical things taken. Not emotional packing. Planned packing. When? He asked. About an hour ago. His jaw tightened instantly. Why was I not informed? The servant swallowed hard. Lady Sane said not to disturb you. That landed harder than anger would have. Haler glanced toward the desk beside the fireplace, then froze. The bond ribbon rested there neatly folded, cut directly through the center. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. 3 years ago, he tied that ribbon around Celine's wrist himself beneath the royal moon ceremony. She wore it every day afterward. Even during arguments, even during betrayals, she pretended not to notice. And now it sat abandoned like something meaningless. Kai picked up one severed half carefully. Something cold settled beneath his ribs. She's left before, one guard offered carefully from behind him. Yes, Keller answered automatically. Because Celine always came back. After political humiliations, after broken promises, after nights, he made her feel invisible beside court alliances. She forgave, stayed, adjusted herself around his mistakes until he stopped noticing how much she sacrificed to remain beside him. She'll forgive me. She always does. The memory hit suddenly, sharp enough to make his stomach turn. Kot looked toward the shattered silence of the room again. This time it felt wrong. Not temporary, final. A captain rushed into the chambers. Moments later. Your Majesty, the gates remain open. We can still stop her before she reaches the lower roads. Keller immediately grabbed his coat from the chair beside the fireplace. Seal every exit. The captain hesitated briefly. The court council. I don't care about the council. The answer came too fast. Too emotional. Everyone in the room noticed. Ka moved toward the doorway before stopping once more beside the desk. His gaze fell again to the severed ribbon. No note, no accusation, no goodbye, just absence. And somehow that terrified him more than rage ever could because for the first time since knowing Celine, she left without asking him to follow. Keller closed his hand tightly around the cut ribbon, then walked out of the chambers already knowing one thing with growing certainty. This was the first time she truly intended not to return. Rain started before dawn, cold and relentless. Kaya barely noticed. His horse tore through the southern roads at full speed, while guards struggled to keep pace behind him. Mud splashed across black riding boots. Wind cut through his coat. Still, he rode faster because something about Celine's empty chambers kept replaying in his mind. Not anger, not grief, certainty. She had already decided to leave long before tonight. That realization unsettled him more than betrayal ever could. A scout rode back from the lower pass several hours later. We found tracks near the southern cliffs. Carr pulled sharply on the reins. How far ahead? Not far. One rider. No escort. Of course, she traveled alone. Celine never asked people to carry burdens she considered hers. The thought twisted unpleasantly inside his chest. They reached the cliffs near sunrise. Rain hammered violently against stone while trackers examined the soaked ground carefully. One finally looked up. She crossed the border here. Kalar dismounted immediately. Into whose territory? The tracker hesitated, then answered carefully. Alpha King Rieger. Silence crashed through the group. Even the guards shifted uneasily because everyone knew Rieger's reputation. Strategic, untouchable, the only alpha powerful enough to challenge Ka openly without fearing political fallout afterward. And worst of all, Rieger noticed weakness faster than most people noticed weather. Kyer mounted again instantly. Move. The southern fortress appeared through the storm nearly an hour later. Massive black walls cut directly into the mountain cliffs overlooking the border valley, and the gates were already open. Carr's jaw tightened immediately like they had been expecting him. Guards crossed spears the moment his horse entered the outer courtyard. You don't enter uninvited, one warned coldly. Kyer ignored him completely. Where is she? Another voice answered before the guard could speak. Safe. Rieger descended the fortress stairs slowly. Dark coat dry despite the rain, expression unreadable, completely unhurried. Carr stepped off his horse sharply. You knew she was coming. No, Rieger replied calmly. But I recognized someone exhausted when she arrived. That landed harder than expected. Ka's expression darkened. Send her out. Rieger stopped several feet away. No. The courtyard fell silent instantly. Ka moved closer. She belongs in my territory. Rieger tilted his head slightly. Interesting choice of words considering she fled it willingly. Ka's patience snapped thinner. This doesn't concern you. Rieger almost smiled. It concerns me whenever someone reaches my gates, looking relieved to escape another alpha. The sentence struck with brutal precision because Ka remembered Celine's face outside the lounge doors. Not devastated. Finished. Rieger studied him for several long seconds before speaking again. You only came because she finally stopped waiting for you. Silence followed immediately. Cold, sharp, dangerous, because Carr hated how true the accusation sounded. And deep down that frightened him more than the storm surrounding the fortress ever could. The storm eased slightly by morning. Cold mist drifted across the fortress courtyard. While Carr stood facing Rieger beneath the towering stone walls, neither alpha moved first, neither backed down. The guards surrounding them remained tense enough to snap. Ka's voice stayed controlled. You're sheltering someone bonded to another territory. Rieger crossed his arms casually. She crossed my border alone voluntarily. That doesn't make her yours. Rieger's expression sharpened slightly. Interesting. You only sound possessive after she leaves. Silence hit hard. Kyer stepped closer. Where is she? Resting. Ka's jaw tightened immediately. I didn't ask whether she was comfortable. No, Rieger replied calmly. You asked like she was property. The accusation landed cleanly. Dangerously cleanly. Kyer looked away first, irritated by how quickly Rieger identified weaknesses he spent years ignoring. She misunderstood what she heard. Rieger laughed once under his breath. No, he said. She understood perfectly. That answer sharpened Kylo's temper instantly. You weren't there. I didn't need to be. Rieger descended the final fortress step until they stood nearly eye level. Women don't flee kingdoms overnight because of one careless sentence. Kalar said nothing because deep down he knew this wasn't about one sentence. It was about years. Years of expecting Celine to stay, no matter how little he gave in return. Rieger noticed the realization crossing his expression. She arrived exhausted. He continued quietly, not emotional, not hysterical, just tired. Kyer hated hearing that because it sounded permanent. She asked for sanctuary. He asked carefully. Yes. Did she mention me? Rieger held his gaze steadily. Only once. Kaler waited. Rieger's next words came slowly. She said, forgiveness becomes dangerous when people start depending on it. Silence followed. Kor felt the truth of it settle heavily in his chest. He remembered every time Selene stayed after betrayal. Every apology delivered lazily because he believed she would accept it eventually. Every moment he mistook loyalty for permanence. Rieger watched him quietly. You loved being forgiven, he said, because it meant you never had to fear consequences. Kar's expression hardened. Careful. But the warning lacked force because again the words were true. A fortress servant approached carefully, then stopped beside Rieger. My king, she said softly. Lady Selene is awake. Kaler immediately looked toward the fortress doors. Instinct, hope, fear, all at once. Rha noticed every emotion crossing his face. She doesn't look broken, he said calmly. That surprised Ka more than it should have because some part of him expected tears, pain, visible heartbreak. Instead, Selene recovered enough to sleep peacefully inside another Alpha's fortress after only one night away from him. That realization hurt unexpectedly deep. Rieger stepped aside slightly toward the fortress entrance. You can speak to her, he allowed. Then his expression cooled again. But understand something first. Kyer looked at him sharply. Rieger's voice lowered. She didn't come here hoping you'd follow. Footsteps echoed softly from the upper fortress corridor. Ka looked up immediately. Selena appeared at the top of the stone staircase, wrapped in a dark wool cloak unfamiliar to him. Not palace silk, not royal colors, something simpler. And somehow that disturbed him more because she already looked less connected to his world. She descended slowly without hesitation. Carefully. Kaler lowered his voice. What I said wasn't serious. Selena's gaze sharpened slightly. That's supposed to help. He hesitated. Mistake because she immediately saw it. Kor tried again. The council exaggerates everything. I was handling politics. You laughed. The words cut straight through his explanation. Simple, precise, impossible to defend against. Kyer looked away briefly before forcing himself back to meet her eyes. It wasn't meant to hurt you. Selene folded her arms loosely against the cold morning air. You didn't break me when you betrayed me, she said quietly. Kaya froze. She continued before he could interrupt. You broke me when you laughed about it. Silence slammed down across the fortress courtyard. Even the guards nearby stopped moving because everyone understood the difference. Betrayal could sometimes be survived. Humiliation rarely could. Kaya's voice lowered further. Selene. No. The interruption came calm but absolute. For years, I kept forgiving things you never truly regretted. That landed harder than accusation, because again, it was true. Selene looked toward the distant mountains beyond the fortress walls before speaking again. You stopped valuing forgiveness because you thought it was guaranteed. Kyer had no immediate answer. The absence of one said enough. Rieger finally moved slightly beside the entrance, but still didn't interfere. He understood something Kar still struggled with. This conversation wasn't about convincing her anymore. It was about witnessing consequences too late to stop them. Ka stepped closer one final time. Come home. Selene looked at him for several long seconds, then quietly asked, which one? The question hit with brutal force because neither of them truly believed the palace had ever been hers. Not completely. The fortress quieted after midday. Most guards returned to patrol roads while cold mountain winds swept through the open corridors overlooking the border cliffs. Sin stood alone near the eastern balcony, watching clouds move across distant valleys below. Peaceful, strange. For the first time in years, nobody demanded anything from her. No court appearances, no political smiles, no pretending betrayal hurt less than it did. Footsteps approached behind her eventually, steady, unhurried. Rieger stopped beside the balcony railing without speaking immediately. Unlike Carr, he seemed comfortable with silence. Selene appreciated that more than expected. You didn't sleep much, he observed finally. She gave a faint shrug. New places. Rieger glanced sideways at her. No, people who leave permanently rarely sleep the first night afterward. The accuracy startled her slightly. You sound experienced. I rule a border fortress, he replied calmly. Half the people arriving here are running from something. Selene looked back toward the valley, and the other half realizing they should have left sooner. That almost pulled a laugh from her. Almost. Rieger noticed anyway. You still defend him in your head? He said. Selena frowned slightly. I'm not defending anyone. Yes, you are. She looked toward him fully now. Rieger leaned casually against the stone railing. You keep explaining his behavior like understanding it somehow excuses it. Silence followed. Because again, he wasn't entirely wrong. Selene exhaled slowly. 3 years doesn't disappear overnight. No, Rieger agreed. But respect can. The words settled heavily between them. Selene stared down at her hands resting against the balcony stone. I stayed through things I shouldn't have. Why? The question came without judgment. That made answering harder. Finally, she admitted quietly. Because every time he apologized, I convinced myself loyalty mattered. Rieger studied her carefully. And eventually, Selena's expression turned distant. Eventually, forgiveness became routine. Not love, not healing routine. Rieger nodded once like he understood perfectly. That's the dangerous part. She glanced toward him again. He continued calmly. People stop fearing loss when they think devotion is permanent. The sentence struck uncomfortably close to truth. Selene remembered every time Carr betrayed trust carelessly because somewhere deep down he believed she would remain anyway. She had proven him right too many times. Rieger noticed the realization crossing her face. You didn't leave because he hurt you once, he said quietly. You left because he stopped respecting the fact you stayed at all. Silence filled the balcony afterward. Cold wind moved through Selene's cloak, while emotions she spent years suppressing finally settled into something clearer. Not heartbreak, exhaustion. Rieger pushed away from the railing slowly. One question, he said before leaving. Selene looked at him. When was the last time anyone chose you without expecting something in return? The question followed her long after he disappeared down the corridor because painfully she couldn't remember the answer. And for the first time since leaving the palace. That realization hurt more than Kylo's words ever did. Kyra remained at the border fortress 3 more days. Long enough for rumors to spread across neighboring territories. Long enough for council members back home to begin panicking, and long enough to realize Selene truly had no intention of returning. The realization settled slowly, painfully. Like watching a door close inch by inch while understanding too late that you were the one who pushed it shut. Kalar stood alone in the fortress courtyard before sunrise, staring at the mountains beyond the eastern walls. Sleep had become impossible. Every quiet moment replayed memories he once dismissed carelessly. Selene waiting through late council nights. Selene smiling politely beside women he publicly entertained for alliances. Selene forgiving apologies he barely meant because he assumed forgiveness itself would never end. She always stays. The sentence sounded uglier every time he remembered saying it. Footsteps approached behind him. Rieger. Of course you still haven't left. Rieger observed calmly. Kat didn't look at him. She refuses to speak with me. She already said everything important. The irritation in Ka's expression sharpened instantly. You seem very confident about understanding her. Rieger crossed his arms loosely. No, I just listened when she finally stopped pretending she was fine. That landed hard because Kir realized something uncomfortable. Selene had been unhappy for far longer than he noticed. Maybe longer than he cared to notice. She belonged beside me, Kir said quietly. Rayer's gaze sharpened slightly. Did she? Silence. Dangerous silence. Kalar exhaled slowly through clenched teeth. I gave her status, protection, and expected gratitude in return. Ka turned sharply toward him. That's not fair. Rieger almost smiled. No, he replied calmly. What's unfair is loving someone so conditionally they start believing endurance is the same thing as devotion. The word struck with brutal precision. Again, Kure hated that because each conversation inside this fortress stripped away another excuse he built around his own behavior. He looked toward the upper balcony instinctively. Selena stood there quietly wrapped in a dark cloak, watching the valley below. Not him. The distance between them suddenly felt enormous. Rieger noticed too. She's calmer here, he said. Kar's jaw tightened because nobody here asks her to earn basic respect. Silence followed. Kar watched Celine for several long seconds before speaking again. I never thought she'd actually leave. There it was, the truth underneath everything. Rieger nodded once. Exactly, Kaler frowned. RHA's expression remained unreadable. You loved her loyalty, he said quietly. But you stopped fearing her absence. That sentence settled heavier than any accusation before it. Because Kure finally understood the real reason this felt irreversible. Celine didn't leave impulsively. She left after years of slowly disappearing beside someone who never noticed until silence replaced forgiveness completely. And now for the first time since knowing her, Kar couldn't picture a path leading her back to him anymore. That terrified him more than losing territory ever could. Morning sunlight spread across the fortress walls in pale gold. The storm had finally passed, but nothing between Celine and Kar felt repaired. She stood near the open eastern gates dressed for travel once again. Gloves pulled tightly over her hands while servants loaded supplies onto waiting horses nearby. Kar watched every movement carefully, still hoping, still refusing to fully accept what was happening. You're leaving again, he said quietly. Celine adjusted the clasp of her cloak. Yes, where? She looked toward the mountain roads ahead. Somewhere that doesn't expect me to stay after being treated badly. The answer struck harder than anger because she sounded calm. Certain. Finished. Kyer stepped closer. Celine, we can fix this. Rieger stood several feet away beside the fortress gates, but remained silent, watching, waiting. Celine finally looked directly at Kar again. No, she said softly. You can't. The finality in her voice unsettled him immediately. Kaler exhaled sharply. You're ending 3 years over one conversation. Celine's expression changed then. Not sadness, disappointment. No, she corrected quietly. I'm ending 3 years of being loved only when it was convenient. Silence settled across the courtyard. Even the guards nearby looked away awkwardly. Kylo lowered his voice. That isn't true. Celine held his gaze steadily. You loved being forgiven more than you loved me. The words landed cleanly. Brutally because deep down he knew she was right. Every apology he offered carried confidence she would stay afterward. Every betrayal became survivable because he believed her loyalty outweighed her self-respect until finally it didn't. Kor moved one step closer desperately. I came after you. Yes, Selena replied calmly after hearing me leave. That answer stripped all heroism from his pursuit instantly. Rieger glanced between them once before quietly opening the fortress gates wider. Cold mountain wind swept into the courtyard. Freedom waiting directly beyond it. Kar looked toward Rieger sharply. You benefit from this. RHA's expression remained unreadable. No, he said calmly. She does. Silence followed again. Selena picked up her travel bag afterward and moved toward the gate slowly. Kar's chest tightened unexpectedly because only now did he fully understand something irreversible. She wasn't hesitating anymore. No waiting for him to explain. No lingering hope he would become better eventually. Just departure, permanent and calm. He spoke one final time. Celine. She paused briefly near the gate, but didn't turn around. Kaya swallowed hard. Will I ever see you again? A long silence followed. Then she answered quietly. Not if I can help it. The words shattered whatever remained between them. Sane walked forward afterward beside Rieger without another glance behind her. And this time she never came back. Not while she spent years earning space beside someone who assumed she would never leave it. Kyre's silence answered for him. Selene nodded faintly afterward, like confirmation instead of disappointment. Then she stepped backward toward the fortress doors again, away from